Today, I'll be looking at Robert Mundell's theory of optimum currency areas. Firstly, a bit of background. Robert Mundell won the 1999 prize in economics and comes from the monetarist or supply-side school of the discipline. But most importantly, he contributed a lot to discussions on exchange rate systems. He is sometimes referred to the father of the euro due to the contributions his work made to the design of the eurozone. Mundell's 1961 paper on optimum currency area theory was concerned with balance of payments crises, particularly the predominant argument at the time from his contemporaries that a system of floating exchange rates would resolve balance of payment crises for good. If we wanted to sum up Mundell's argument in a problematique thesis format, his problematique would probably be which exchange rate system is optimal for maintaining the stability and smooth functioning of the international economy. Mundell's answer, or thesis, is that whilst a free floating exchange rate system may be more responsive to fluctuations in the balance of trade between countries, its effectiveness hinges on how well the boundaries of currency areas align with underlying economic regions. Firstly, Mundell shows the difference between a currency area sharing a currency and a currency area comprised of several different currencies. In our example, let's imagine a world economy with two countries called something original, like Oceania and East Asia. Importantly, let's assume that prices cannot be reduced to make goods more competitive and that wages are inflexible. Now let's imagine there's a shift in demand from East Asia to Oceania. Demand for Oceania's exports increase, while demand for East Asia's exports decrease. We have a trade imbalance. A net flow of money from East Asia towards Oceania occurs. There is inflationary pressure in Oceania as more money chases after the same amount of goods, and there is deflationary pressure in East Asia as demand decreases for their goods. Because each country has its own central monetary authority, the burden of adjustment will often be put on deficit regions like East Asia. This is because Oceania's central bank has the goal of keeping inflation within certain limits, and will refuse to let an increase in the price of its goods correct the trade imbalance by making their goods less competitive with respect to East Asia's. Consequently, the burden of adjustment is often put on deficit regions such as East Asia, and it must reduce its imports by reducing its national income, thereby reducing demands for imports from Oceania and restoring a more favourable external position. The tendency of surplus countries to exert strict control on the acceptable levels of inflation imposes a recessionary tendency on the global economy, compelling deficit countries to correct trade imbalances through contractionary economic policy. Now, Mundell moves on to two regions sharing a currency. In this case, I've chosen northern and southern Italy, albeit with some artistic license on their geographic accuracy. We'll repeat the same scenario with funds from southern Italy flowing to northern Italy due to a high level of demand for northern Italy's goods. In this case, however, there is only one central bank. Because the priority of a central monetary authority often leads to maintaining or reaching full employment, the burden of adjustment will be put on the surplus regions through inflation, as the central bank worsens the situation by pursuing expansionary monetary policy to boost the ailing southern economy and prevent the associated unemployment. We have then our two examples. Example 1, Oceania and East Asia. There were two countries, each with its own currency and a fixed exchange rate. There were two central monetary authorities, and the burden of adjustment was put on deficit regions, who were forced to reduce national income to lower demand for imports. In this system, there was a recessionary bias. In example 2, northern and southern Italy, we had two regions sharing a currency. There was one central monetary authority, and, as a result, the burden of adjustment was put on the surplus region that had to endure inflation. There is thus an inflationary bias in a multi-regional currency area. We thus come to the arguments of Mundell's contemporaries, such as Milton Friedman, who say that, in a floating exchange rate system, appreciation or depreciation of a currency can replace the need for inflation or unemployment in order to rectify trade imbalances. In our earlier example of Oceania and East Asia, the flow of money will result in an appreciation of Oceania's exchange rate, making exports less competitive with respect to East Asia. On the flip side, in East Asia, we would see a depreciation relative to Oceania. Exports would become cheaper relative to Oceania and demand would increase. The trade balance would be restored. It would thus appear our answer to the problems of trade imbalances is simple. We just need to move to a system of floating exchange rates, and appreciation or depreciation can take the place of inflation and unemployment. But is it that simple? Mundell argues that it isn't. Let's take again our example of Oceania and East Asia and split each country into two regions, a western region that's car producing and an eastern region that's timber producing. Now let's imagine there's an increase in demand for lumber products and a decrease in demand for car products. Money will flow from the western regions to the eastern regions. There will be an inflationary bias in the eastern surplus regions and a deflationary bias in the western deficit regions. But most importantly, the external position of Oceania and East Asia has remained the same. The trade imbalances between regions rather than currency areas, and an exchange rate fluctuation will not help. Mundell's key takeaway here is that if the trade disparity is taking place within currency areas, a fluctuation on the foreign exchange market does not fix the issue. Regional economic divergence is the issue rather than the exchange rate system. Now let's imagine we redraw the boundaries of the two currency areas so that the two eastern regions share a currency and the two western regions share a currency. Here, a free-floating exchange rate would rectify the imbalance and prevent inflation or unemployment in either region. This is because the increased demand for the timber of the eastern regions would result in an appreciation of their currency, leading to their exports becoming less competitive and decreasing demand. The western regions would see a depreciation of their currency relative to the east. Their exports would become cheaper, more competitive, and demand would increase, restoring the trade balance. Mundell thus shows that the argument for flexible exchange rates is not as watertight as it seems. Mundell's contemporaries were often quick to argue that the 1920s gold standard, one of the most prolific fixed exchange rate regimes, had a tendency to transmit recessionary tendencies and contributed to the length and severity of the Great Depression. However, as we have seen, in a multi-regional single currency area, there is a similar tendency for deficit regions to rein in spending to reduce demand for imports through reductions in national income. This, in turn, reduces the demand for the exports from surplus regions, imparting a recessionary bias on the economy. Floating exchange rates can only perform a stabilising function if currency areas are delineated regionally. Mundell now turns to the crux of his argument, which is the notion of a region. Ricardo's theories of trade relied on the internal mobility of factors of production. However, this often does not hold and has implications for discussions on currency regimes. As Mundell explains, the argument for flexible exchange rates based on national currencies is only as valid as the Ricardian assumption about factor mobility. Ricardo's assumptions of factor mobility only hold within regions, not countries. Importantly, Mundell here is defining a region as an area with internal factor mobility. If a currency area adheres to national lines, as it normally does, rather than regional ones, a floating exchange rate regime will not be capable of correcting trade imbalances. Mundell thus shows that the importance of factor mobility pushes us towards maximising the number of currency areas, arguing that each region should, ideally, have its own currency. There are, however, other considerations that push us towards fewer currency areas and away from this currency per region demand. Firstly, costs increase with the number of currencies in existence. Constantly converting currencies is a significant drag on the smooth functioning of an economy, particularly in floating exchange rate regimes, where individuals can never be quite sure of the value of their currency. Ideally, in the interest of simplicity and certainty, there is an ideal of having one currency area from this standpoint. A second consideration is that having smaller currency areas would make them more vulnerable to speculative attacks. This is particularly a concern with floating exchange rates. In 1992, the actions of one man, George Soros, led to Great Britain's exit from the exchange rate mechanism due to market speculation. Who knows the havoc that would ensue if smaller currency areas made these sort of speculative attacks possible with a smaller level of financial resources. A third and final consideration raised by Mundell is that smaller currency areas would demonstrate greater wage inflexibility. The way that depreciation works to rectify trade imbalances is by making imports more expensive. In larger currency areas, imports comprise a smaller percentage of total consumption, and thus the money illusion, whereby workers do not campaign for an increase in real wages, but rather in nominal wages, holds. In smaller currency areas, however, the impact of increasing import prices would shatter this money illusion, as imports comprise a larger percentage of total consumption. Workers would be more aware of their declining purchasing power and resist this reduction by striking for higher wages, making devaluation a less attractive and less effective way of correcting trade imbalances. These three considerations push us in the opposite direction then. There is a tendency for us to want to aim for a minimal number of currency areas from these considerations. There is thus a tension between the best exchange rate system for regions, which are economic units defined by internal factor mobility, and the best exchange rate system for nations, historically determined and oblivious to these underlying economic regional disparities as they are. Free-floating exchange rates only correct trade imbalances to the extent that currency areas align with regions. Perhaps the most overt example of the utility of Mundell's theory of optimum currency areas was the Eurozone crisis. whereby the regional disparities within the single Eurozone currency area led to the sovereign debt crisis of the 2010s. Many economists have used Mundell's theory to show why the Eurozone was flawed from the start. It attempted to bundle diverse economic regions under one currency. This, in turn, led to the deterioration of public finances in the southern economies and led to the Eurozone crisis.